On December 24th, 1953, as most of New Zealand was already celebrating Christmas, the 3 p.m. express train from Wellington was still running steadily through the cold night. On board were 285 passengers and crew, carrying gifts, well wishes, and hopes of seeing their loved ones the next morning. The steam-powered KA class train, pulling 11 carriages, passed through Tangiwai right on time. 10:20 p.m., at a speed of approximately 40 miles per hour. No one knew that just minutes before, an invisible disaster had just occurred ahead. On Mount Ruapehu, there were no explosions, no signs of an eruption, but a natural tephra dam holding back the crater lake burst, releasing a lahar, mud, rock, and hot water that surged down the Huanggehu River like a dark night flood. In a matter of moments, the mudslide completely engulfed a main bridge pier of the Tangiwai Iron Bridge. Just before the train arrived, a few minutes later, engineer Charles Parker saw something unusual. The bridge was dark and unstable, or perhaps he saw Cyril Ellis, a passerby, frantically waving a flashlight to warn him. Parker immediately gasped and slammed on the brakes. Fireman Lance Redmond cut the oil valve to stop the fire. They did everything they could, but it's too late. The train plunged into the void. The bridge collapsed. The locomotive, oil tanker, and 5 second-class carriages plunged straight into the black floodwaters. The first-class cabin floated for a few seconds. Then the hook slipped, and it fell. Only the last few carriages remained stuck on the tracks, trembling in the darkness. 151 people died, including Parker, Redmond, 148 second-class passengers, and 1 first-class passenger. 20 bodies were never found, possibly swept 120 kilometers out to sea. Among the fatalities was Narissa Love, the fiancée of cricketer Bob Blair, who was playing in a test match in South Africa at the same time. On going out to bat after his loss, Blair received a standing ovation. Tangiwai became the worst railroad disaster in New Zealand's history, and a reminder that sometimes, even when the sky is calmest, nature can still lay a deadly trap right at our feet. On the morning of December 6, 1917, Halifax was preparing to enter the peaceful Christmas holidays. The Christmas tree has been put up, and decorative lights are strung along the streets. No one in this small port city knew that in just an hour, Halifax would become the epicenter of the largest explosion in human history. Amidst the cold morning mist, the French cargo ship SS Mont Blanc was quietly entering the harbor. On its deck, gasoline, TNT, picric acid, and gun cotton, all heavy explosives from the war transport line. In the opposite direction is the SS Emo, an empty Norwegian relief ship hurrying to leave port. Just a slight deviation in navigation. The speed is only about 1.9 kilometers per hour, but right at 8:45, the two hulls collided. A slight collision, but enough to tear open the fuel tank on the deck of the Mont Blanc. The gasoline vaporized, caught a spark from the friction of the metal, and then ignited. The fierce flames gradually climbed up the deck as the ship, carrying hundreds of tons of explosives, drifted into the center of Halifax like a living torch. 20 minutes later, at 9:04:35, the Mont Blanc exploded. The explosion released the energy equivalent of 2.9 kilotons of TNT. Richmond, a densely populated residential area, was wiped off the map. The entire structure within a radius of nearly 800 meters turned into rubble. The shockwave bent the tracks, shattered windows dozens of kilometers away, and tossed Imo onto the shore like a toy. A tsunami struck immediately after the explosion, sweeping away the Mi'kmaq community that had lived in Tufts Cove for generations. When the smoke cleared, Halifax was no longer a city preparing for Christmas. It is a region of ashes with 1,782 dead, over 9,000 injured, and thousands of homes destroyed. Snow began to fall that afternoon, covering the rubble in a silent white layer. Many surviving witnesses say the most terrifying thing wasn't the explosion, but it was absolute silence right after that. It was so silent that you'd think you were the only one left. On the night of December 24th, 1913, the mining town of Calumet, the heart of Michigan's copper mining region, was bathed in a rare warmth. The mining families, who already lived in cold hardship, were threatened with unemployment and worked tirelessly underground, finally had an evening to breathe. The second floor of the hall was packed with nearly 500 people, mostly women and young children of the striking miners. They sang carols, gave gifts, and tried to forget the harsh winter and the weeks of fear outside. Then, a stranger walked in. No one knows who he is. No one remembers his face. Everyone only remembers him shouting one word: fire! In that moment, joy turned into chaos. No one saw the fire anywhere, but panic spread faster than any flame. The crowd poured toward the narrow staircase leading down to the main entrance, and that is the deadly trap. At the bottom of the stairs, the door was jammed. It was believed to open inward, but documents indicated it actually opened outward, pressed shut by the crowd to the point where it couldn't be moved. In a few seconds, hundreds of bodies were crammed together. Adults were knocked down. Small children are buried. The cries were choked under layers of people desperate to survive. When rescue workers arrived, they found a pile of bodies stacked high from the foot of the stairs, all the way up to the middle, like a wall of human flesh, frozen in fear and cold. 73 people died in the stampede. 58 of them are children. However, what is the most unacceptable thing? No one found evidence of fire. There's no smoke. There wasn't even a small spark. There was only one scream, which many people believe was an anti-unionist deliberately creating chaos to disrupt the striking miners' party. That Christmas night, what killed people wasn't fire, but fear. On the Christmas night of 1971, Seoul was ablaze with lights. The city is preparing for the most modern post-war Christmas season. Christmas music echoes through the streets, shops display Christmas trees, and luxury hotels like Daeyeonggak become ideal gathering places for year-end parties. None of them knew that Daeyeonggak, a symbol of extravagant nights, would turn into a 22-story incinerator in just a few hours. Around midnight, a gas explosion erupted from the lower level. The initial fire was small, but the interior structure, covered in flammable materials, caused it to spread down the hallway at an alarming rate. Inside the hotel, the music was still playing, the laughter still echoed, until black smoke began billowing from the elevators and pouring into the ballroom. Someone ran over and pressed the fire alarm button, but the system, it's not working. Just a few minutes later, Daeyeonggak turned into a giant chimney. The fire climbed up the stairwell, spreading straight up to the upper floors like a fire snake hungry for prey. Guests in evening gowns and formal suits desperately broke windows, and many were forced to jump from high floors to escape the heat and toxic smoke that was tightening their lungs. When rescue forces arrived, the temperature inside the hotel had exceeded the limit that humans could survive. A large part of the building collapsed in the sea of fire. A total of 163 people died, making it the world's worst hotel disaster at the time. The next morning, Seoul was silent without the sounds of festival music. Instead, there were patches of gray smoke rising from the blackened tower. A Christmas where fire stole all the light and left a costly lesson in fire safety for millions. Christmas Eve, 1851, Washington, D.C. It's strangely peaceful. The oil lamp flickered and snow fell silently on the marble steps. In the Capitol building, which houses the Library of Congress, only a few night shift employees remain. No one knew that in just a few hours, the intellectual heart of America would be completely burned to the ground. Around midnight, a small fire quietly broke out inside the book storage room. It started with a leaky gas lamp, a minor technical fault that no one noticed. But beside that fire are dry wooden bookshelves, documents, manuscripts, maps, and original notes from the founding era of the United States. In just a few minutes, the hallway was filled with smoke. Within a few dozen minutes, the fire had become a nightmare. The night watchman tried to put out the fire with a bucket of water, but fire systems at that time were almost non-existent. The fire climbed to the ceiling, splashed down onto the bookshelves, and devoured everything it touched. When the fire department arrived, they saw what one witness described as, "A sea of fire is devouring each page like a hungry monster." Ultimately, 35,000 books, including nearly Thomas Jefferson's entire collection, the first survey maps, legislative documents, and rare 17th century prints, were reduced to ashes. The scrolls of manuscript were so badly burned that individual words were indistinguishable. On Christmas morning, it was still snowing, but instead of landing on the roof covered with decorative lights, it fell onto the pile of black ash where American history was once kept. They say the most painful disaster isn't losing books, but it's the feeling of seeing the memories of an entire nation turn to smoke, just because of a small spark on Christmas night. The Christmas Flood of 1717. On Christmas Day in 1717, along the North Sea coast, Dutch, German, and Scandinavian villages were bathed in the peaceful glow of candlelight. No one knew that night that nature was planning one of the most devastating disasters in European history. At first, it was just the wind whistling through the roof and a few strong waves crashing against the shore, not enough to make anyone suspicious. But just a few hours later, a powerful northwest storm began to form, causing unusually high sea levels. Science calls this phenomenon a storm surge, a silent killer. When the black water wall came crashing down, the already weak dikes had no chance. They broke in large numbers. Within hours, floodwaters surged into Groningen, Zwolle, Dokkum, and even Amsterdam and Haarlem. The whole village disappeared into the Christmas darkness. Houses were swept away. Livestock are dying en masse. The survivors climbed onto the roof, shivering in the cold, not knowing who in their family was still alive. A total of 14,000 people drowned. The coastal region from Tundra to Emden alone lost over 9,000 lives. Buchadingan lost 30% of its population. Hundreds of homes were completely wiped out, and many victims were not found until weeks later. 2 days later, heavy snow and ice swept down, sealing off all search efforts, as if nature wanted to hide the entire destruction under a white blanket.